Welcome back. This is the Fender chassis. My name's Scott. This is part 2 of the header refurb video. Now, I told you a couple things in the last video on how we were going to repair this header, and I'm going to shift things around a little bit. Rather than doing one tube at a time and cutting them all the way back to the flange, what we're going to do is we're actually going to remove both of these tubes. Now, the reason for removing one at a time is just so that if there's any internal stresses built up when this thing was originally put together, that this thing doesn't move around anymore than it has to. But after looking at it, I think I've got a little bit of a better plan. What we're going to do is this third tube back, we're going to remove it all the way to the flange, cut it somewhere down here, and then this fourth tube, we're going to cut it as well down in this area to get past all this junk that somebody else did. But we're going to leave about this much of this elbow up here. Part of the reason for that is the flange. The tube where it goes into the flange is not round, so it has to be formed. Makes it a little more difficult work up here, and if it's already completed, there's no reason to redo it. And we'll actually put this tube back in first, and that way we can get and weld all the way around on both ends, and then we'll return and do this tube. And we may have to do a access window like we did on the other tube, but this one, since it's going all the way to the flange, we will have no problems on the upper end. So next thing to do is to go ahead and get this thing cut apart. So let me get some tools out, get some things set up, and I'll be right back and show you how that goes. Okay, so here we are. We're going to cut the bottom side of these tubes first. What I did was I just selected a spot, and really it's right in the center of this bend, and I just took a square, and this isn't really the most accurate way, but use a square, transfer the line over to this tube, piece of cardboard with a straight edge, wrapped around the tube, made this cut, and then just extended this line just to give me something to go by. There's no way to wrap that cardboard around this tube in the middle of a bend. So we're gonna take a Sawzall and go ahead and get these tubes cut off of here, at least this end. Now, there's no way to mark this to get a square cut on that bend, so I'm just going to eyeball this to where I think it's the most perpendicular cross section. Now, one thing you can see, since we got this thing cut apart, there were some stresses involved here because you can see this tube is shifted and it's not lined up down here. And you can see how flexy that this flange is. So what we'll have to do when we fit this thing up is we'll clamp this flange to the workbench evenly so that we keep this plane straight. So next thing is to go ahead and get this tube cut off from the inside and get this out of here. So let me get some things moved around. Be right back. Okay, so what we've got to do now is we've got to get this tube released from this flange. Now, the way this was done originally was the tube protruded through, and then they welded to the flange, then added a bead of material around here, and then came back later and planed that off. Now, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get this tube released without affecting this raised surface. And then when we return this section back, we will just have to put a weld bead right on that corner, and there may have to be some final resurfacing to get that that bead to go flush or below the surface. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a die grinder with a ball-ended carbide burr and go on the inside and try to cut all the way around that to get that tube to release. So let's see how that goes. Okay, so here we are. We got that tube cut off. You can see what that looks like. That should slip right back in. We ought to be able to weld that back in at the end. Now, what I'm going to do is cut this bend off square if I can. But before I do that, I need this tube because what's going to replace it should go back in a similar location. So we're going to use this for now. Complete. We're going to put it back. We're going to put it back in, and we're going to slide one of these clamps across the joint, and that'll let us know where we can route this tube. Now, off camera, what I've done is I went ahead and prepped these two ends to receive new metal. What I did, I used a die grinder with a little flap wheel. Looks like this is 120 grit, but a little rougher wouldn't have hurt a thing. And I cleaned out the inside of the tubes as they're fairly rusty, and that'll affect your weld when you go back. So I cleaned out the inside of both of these ends, and also took some emery cloth and cleaned up the outside. Now I'll use a grinder later to get where I can, but some of these locations you can't get a grinder, so I used the emery cloth to get everything as good as I could. Now we're going to start by laying out these. There's going to be two bends to get from here to here. So I think on this end I want a short straight section before I go to the bend, but on this end I want to put a bend immediately right here. So what I'm going to do is just rough cut some pieces that are longer than what I need, and I'll show you how I mark them to get the final length. So let me go ahead and chop up a U-bend, and I'll bring you back and show you how to figure out what your final angles are going to be. Okay, so what I did was I cut a section of a U-bend, and I added or I left a straight section, 1.125 here, because that's what appeared to be, you know, what I thought that it needed. And now on this end, what I've got is just a piece of a bend that you know, was just scrap that I had. And I've got those fit up tight against the tube on each end, and I've got them oriented in a direction in which if the bend were cut where it needs to be, that a straight section in between would line them up. Now, from here, what I'm doing is on the outside of each bend, I'm going to lay a straight edge. And then I'm going to line that straight edge up with the inside. Of course, it could be the outside of a bend as well, depending upon how this is working. But where that's going to intersect this tube, so I'll sight through this direction and bring this straight edge down until it closes the gap between. Now, you know, part of this is, I mean, it's not an exact science, but you bring that down so that you basically are, what you're doing is simulating the outside of the tube with this edge of the straight edge. And then when you've got that lined up, then right where the straight edge touches, I've made a mark. Now what I'll do is I'll pull this bend out, put it in the jig that I showed you in video 1, and we'll make a line around it so that it's perpendicular to the center line of the tube, and then we'll cut it. And with this one, what I'll do is I'll actually measure. I've already got it marked as well. Of course, the outside of the bend on it came right through here, so you know, I had to use the straight edge in this fashion here. So I marked it as well, but I'll measure, because I'm not going to use this tube, I'll measure what the angle is, and then I'll leave that on the straight leg of a U-bend, and then I'll fit those up and figure out how long that needs to be and cut that straight leg off where it needs to be. That'll minimize, so then we'll have 1, 2, 3 weld joints. Now we could just go ahead and make this a straight section, just go ahead and cut that bend and weld on both sides of the bend, but that would add a weld, and the least amount of welds the better it looks, or at least in my opinion. So let me get you over to the jig. We'll get these things marked, and then we'll go over to the bandsaw and show you what that looks like when we cut these. So be right back. Okay, so here we are. This is the bend that I need to measure, and so what I'm going to do is just go ahead and line this up with the baseline 0, and then I'm going to actually just transfer the mark onto my jig, and that'll tell me how much of a bend I need to leave on the straight leg. So if I put the straight leg in here now and line it up, and then take my marking fixture, let's make sure this is all square. And then we can just go ahead and mark where that tube needs to be cut. Now, depending upon how confident you are that that's going to be correct, you can leave some extra for fine tuning, and we'll fine tune this anyway on the belt sander. Now, this is the section that we're going to use this straight leg. So we'll get this lined up in here. You know, oddly enough, looks like it's the same. We're close to the same angle. So let's get this one marked. Okay. That's it, off to the bandsaw. Okay, so here we are. We got those two tubes fit up, cut, and ready to work in place. So I went ahead and welded the two joints together. So the next step is to go ahead and get these in place and go ahead and get them welded up. So let's go, let's get after it. Okay, so only got the rear tube welded. So what we're going to do now is we're going to reuse, on this third tube back, we're going to reuse part of this elbow. Now I can see that this dent is around that area right there. I really don't want to use any of that. So we're going to cut right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sight from that line and find where the closest point on the back of that elbow is. So that means that we're going to cut somewhere along that line right there. So let's go over to the bandsaw and get that thing whacked off. Okay, so here's what it looks like after it's cut off. Now, one thing you want to do after you get it cut to make sure you got everything square is just go ahead and put a piece of straight tube up against it. And this curve should transition until it's straight and goes right up that tube, and the same thing on the inside. And then when you look from the outside of the bend, where it actually doesn't look like it's a bend anymore, but you got these straight sides, you want those to be able to follow, and that lets you know that you've got the thing cut tangent to the bend, or should I say perpendicular, whichever way it goes. Anyway, so now all we've got to do, leaving that right there in place, is to fill in the gap from here to here. So let me go do that, and I'll film some of that, but I'm not going to talk while I'm doing it, but I'll tell you what I did after I get there. How's that sound? Okay, so here we are. We got this number 3 tube fit up. I really did have intentions of working with you a little more and showing you a little more about getting this fit up, but you know, it's really more just trial and error. I'm not sure what other tips that I can give you, but anyway, it's done now, and it's just a matter of getting it welded up. Of course, you want to fit these gaps as tightly as possible. I've got one here that's a little wide, but I think I can handle it. But the balance looks pretty good. So what we'll do from here is go ahead, and I'm going to add another. I got 3 tacks on each of these joints. I'm going to add a 4th one to the back side where I couldn't get because I got this thing fixtured up on the table. And then go ahead and finish welding these out. And one thing I don't know if I mentioned before is I went in with a flap wheel and cleaned up the rust on the inside of all these the existing tubes. And then with your new bends, you want to get those clean as well. A lot of times they'll have release fluid from the bender inside. So these have all been cleaned out. And so once this is all welded up, then what we'll do is, just like we did on the driver's side header, we'll come in here and cut a notch out of this tube so that we can make this weld from the inside. Although I can get to the back side of this a little bit, I can't get to each side of the back side. So we'll just mark that by hand, cut it out with a cut-off wheel, and then make that weld and then put it back just like we did on the other side. And then on this other end, once we're all welded in, then we'll go from the inside of the flange, and I'll get you a shot of that when we get to that point. So let me go ahead and get this thing welded up, and we'll go from there. Hey, one other thing that I wanted to let you guys know, a lot of times if you're using this style of a T-bolt clamp to hold these, and if you're going from a straight section to a bend, what happens is these bends actually reduce the diameter of the tube. And so the clamps a lot of times will only clamp down on one of the tubes. So what I do is I put just a little tit of filler metal in 3 spots. And what that does is it lets the clamp down on those 3 spots, those 3 high spots, and then the balance of the clamp will catch the straight section of tube. And then it actually gives you a little bit of the ability to actually put a little twist on it even after the clamp's tightened up. It'll hold it tight enough that it's not going to move on you, but if you need to twist it and adjust your angle, then you can do that as well. So, okay, so there it is, all welded up. Now what we're going to do is take a cut-off wheel and go ahead and cut our window in here so we can go ahead and make this weld here. So let's get after it. Okay, here we are, all finished up. I don't know if I did a real good job giving you any tips on fitting tubes up. It's pretty much a trial and error kind of thing. One thing I don't think I showed you was tin snips. You can trim a tube a lot easier with a pair of tin snips than you can, if you just need to take 1/8 of an inch off, a 3/16 of an inch off. It's a lot easier to do with a pair of tin snips, and these things are good for 16 gauge, which is what these tubes are, is 16 gauge mild steel tubing. So give a pair of tin snips a try. So if you liked what you saw, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. I think my videos are getting better, and as time goes along, hopefully you'll get better and better tips out of them. So appreciate you watching, and I'll see you on the next project.